Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Stimson's webinar, Voices from Japan National Security Speaker Series. I would just let everyone sign on. So if you can wait for a few minutes, we'll get started in about 2 or 3 minutes. Wow. Okay, I think people are still signing on, but let's go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. For those of us who are in the U.S. Early in the morning, and for if there are any of our guests signing in from Japan, good evening. This is the Voices from Japan, our Stimson's Japan program's biggest annual event, happening virtually this year due to COVID, due to the impact of the COVID. But despite that challenge, I'm very honored to have two speakers joining us this morning or this evening, depending on where you are. Honorable Katsu Kanehara, former Assistant Chief Cabinet Secretary, who has had a long career as a diplomat, and then a equally long career under Prime Minister Abe's National Security Secretariat for as Assistant Chief Cabinet Secretary, behind lots of diplomatic concept, including free and open Indo-Pacific. Very honored to have you, Mr. Kanehara. And I'm equally honored to have Ellen Leibson, my former boss, President Emeritus at Stimson, back again joining us in the seminar. She equally has a long distinguished career before joining at Stimson. Within the government, she was a deputy chairman of the National Intelligence Council. Before then, she had worked in the Hill. And then I just learned from Ellen just a couple of days ago that you actually did have worked for then Senator Biden a long time ago. So I'm incredibly looking forward to hearing both of your thoughts on how the recent new leadership change, and in fact, one still underway in the United States, how that will impact the future of the U.S.-Japan alliance. So before we get started, please let me go through a couple of ground rules. For those of you in the audience, please mute yourself. So that the speaker's voice cannot get prevented. And whenever you're not speaking, this is also for you, Mr. Kanehara and Ellen. If it's not your turn, please mute yourself. And I often do this, but if I do this hand signal after I ask you to speak, and that means I'm not hearing you. So just a reminder to unmute yourself, because I'm usually make that mistake myself. During the Q&A session, for those of you who are joining us, if you look at the bottom of the screen, there is a Q&A function. So please do use this to ask our speakers a question. I cannot go back and forth between the chat function, which is right next to it, and Q&A. So I will only be looking at Q&A box once the Q&A gets started. So if you do like to ask a question to the speakers, use this one. But in the meantime, please do mute yourself the whole time. So with that, and I also want to take this opportunity. This Voices from Japan series is an annual event happening from 2013, and this has not been possible without our generous support from Stimson's friends from the Japan program. So in particular, I would like to thank Sachiko Kuno Foundation with Dr. Dr. Kuno, Lockheed Martin, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, Sumitomo Corporation, Itochu Aviation, Boeing, IHI Aerospace, Northrop Grumman, Mitsubishi International Corporation, Sojitsu, and many, many more friends of Japan that have been so supportive of our program activities despite this challenge during the COVID. Without further ado, let's get started. So, Mr. Kanehara and Ellen, please, thank you again for joining us this morning. As we both know, both of our countries have recently go through the leadership changes. So I guess my first question will go to you, Mr. Kanehara, that what do you think is the biggest legacy of Prime Minister Abe when it comes to foreign and security policy, and how in your view, the transition to Prime Minister Suga has been going on? I think we all kind of have the impression that it's much, much smoother than what we are experiencing here. But if you can enlighten us of any kind of a nuanced difference that Prime Minister Suga may be taking in his foreign policy approaches, greatly appreciate if you can share that with us. And to you, Ellen, your question will be very much similar. What do you think is the biggest legacy of the Trump administration, and how? And based on your past experience, you've been on the transition team before. So how does this very messy transition process that we've been seeing at this point, does that give you any concern, and how could that put a challenge as the Biden administration tries to implement its foreign policy agenda? So with that, please, Mr. Kanehara, and then Ellen.
Thank you very much for having me. I have to say that Abe-san laid down the ground strategy for Asia to follow in this century. And we are now at creation of liberal order in Asia. And this is not the case in the States and in Europe. There are a bit, shaky or doubts about the liberal order, but in Asia, it's just starting. In the 19th century, liberal thinking came up very popular, and early 20th century, totalitarianism and communism was a big failure. Again, liberalism is back. And this is our history, the liberal version of our history. Asians were under colonial rule, and they were discriminated. They took back their independence later in the last century, and they turned to democracy one by one proudly. It's only in 1986, the Philippines, 87, Korea, and then ASEAN nations, some, and the Taiwan followed. They're very proud democracies. Shaky, many problems. Yes, Rohingya, extrajudicial killing, and ethnic minorities, and some military people's influence in the government. True, but they're very proud. They're headed to join our liberal order and the global one. We have to push this forward. And big challenge is China. China was our partner to face Russians a long time, and we worked hard to pull their hands to bring them into the liberal order. WTO, even after Tiananmen, our emperor went to Beijing. The foreign ministry was very much criticized for ignoring the abuse of human rights, massacring the kids crying freedom. But we stood by China because we believed that China would be like us one day. And it was not the case. And is this the final course of China? I don't think so. We can still engage China, but we have to craft a ground strategy for that. Otherwise, China would have their own way. And it's only US who can face China alone. The others cannot. But US is stronger when they are united with the allies and friends. And we have to do it. Otherwise, your American friends would be surrendering to China one by one, from the weak ones to strong ones. If Japan surrenders, everybody else would surrender except the United States. So we have to craft a ground strategy to engage China. China is 60% of world GNP. US is less than 25%. Europe, the same size. Japan is 7-8%. India is half size of Japan. That means US, Europe, Japan, India could easily go beyond 50% of world GNP. That means China will not be a global hegemon. China will be a regional hegemon. That means if the West is united, we can still engage China. We have to craft a strategy for that. 3 levels are important. One is the strategy. Strategic balance is very much necessary. And the balance can be kept with advantage on our side. And that is quite. In Asia, we don't have NATO. American system is weak, very much weak in comparison with Europe. We have Japan-US alliance, the US ROK, US Philippines, US Thailand, and US Australia. Korea is a bit confused in strategic directions these days. That's an important partner to engage, but we have only Australia who can stand with us. And it's Japan and Australia alone with the US to face China. We can't do that. We have to bring in India. It's very important. That's quite by embracing China, we alienated Indians. We pushed them towards Russians, and it's not natural. India is the creation of Nehru and Gandhi. In terms of values, India is our natural ally, and we should engage them. They are non-alignment policy supporters. We can't have an alliance, a military with them, but to have a strategic balance with China, we have to engage Indian, the future superpower. The average age is amazingly 29 years old. Chinese 39 years old, Japanese 49 years old. We can see with the most senior. But the next superpower is India. We have to engage them. Second level is the prosperity part. The ASEAN nations are much more interested in prosperity part than the military or balancing part. We have to engage them. Connectivity is a very important one. And we have pushed forward TPP, RCEP, and Japan EU, FTA, and Japan US, TAC, TAG. And Japan is the only nation who is expanding free trade zone in the 21st century. We're doing that. We believe that we are now investor, not exporter. We have to make our companies prosperous outside Japan. For that purpose, we need this free trade system. This is our national interest. And we could engage ASEAN nations to promote their regional economic integration. Chinese OBOR is a bit different. It's China center and then star shape. It's just like Russian pipelines. They want to engage partners one by one in this way. That's very much Chinese way, but our thinking is not the same. We are making matrix type connections in the region to make the free market functions. That's our policy. And we have to realign the friends in this vein of thinking. Last part is democracy. I have to say that we will never be communist. And we cannot say that China will never be democratic. And they are now leaving the West for the moment. Unfortunately, it's the heavy nationalism, expansionist ambitions coming in. Xi Jinping is stepping outside of the right path, unfortunately. But we can't believe that after Xi Jinping is Hitler. It's too early to determine that. We can still engage China, but from the position of strength. We have to do that. And then we have to show them that our system can make people happier than their system. That's what we have to do. Engagement is not preaching. Engagement is not soliciting, not begging, neither teaching. Engagement is mutual persuasion and competition of ideas. And we believe that we can win. Only two things are troublesome. One is tech flow. China is in our system, and they are taking our technology free, and their system is very different from ours. No free enterprises. They're very well connected with the military, and the government is paying a lot of money to the military, to the enterprises. They're catching up with us very quickly, and this part must be controlled. One. Two is Taiwan. Chinese ambition is to take back Taiwan. They took back Xinjiang. They invaded Tibet. They invade somehow Bhutan today. And they're looking at our Senkaku Islands. They claim the whole South China Sea as their own sea. It's much bigger than the Mediterranean. And they're serious about Taiwan. Their army, navy, air force are preparing for an invasion long time. They are serious about it. We believe that they don't do that because if they're defeated, it's the end of the Communist Party. But 10 years later, we don't know. They're now 75% of US size in the economic size. Military budget is only 1/4, but they don't include the development budget. And their forces are becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, and they are very close to Taiwan. This distance is the weakness of our alliance. Americans are too far away. And if Chinese believe that they can finish the war during the 2 weeks war, they might do that. And if the island is taken, we can never take it back. It's a democracy. And the population is 23 million, as big as Malaysia and Australia and Romania. And we cannot lose that democracy like Hong Kong. And that's our credibility is at stake. So we have to show that the democracy matters. It's not the territory history, it's the will of the people. And that's our rule. And we have to show that Taiwan matters. Okay, this is my presentation. Abe-san laid down this grand framework. Suga-san is not the opposition leader. Suga-san is not the challenger to Abe-san. He says he's going to step into his shoes. So he sustained this basic framework. Thank you.
Thank you. I think thank you, Kanehara-san. That might be the best summary that I've ever heard about the Abe administration's free and open Indo-Pacific concept. Thank you very much, Ellen. Ellen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yuki. It's wonderful to be back with my friends at Stimson. Thank you, Yuki, for organizing this. And I agree, Mr. Kanehara, you've given such a broad but brilliant conceptual framework. But I'm going to start with my questions, which are a little more bound in the immediate transition in the United States. So Yuki has asked the important question of what will be the legacy of the Trump administration in foreign policy. And I think we can go quickly to a couple of important themes. He really did want to switch the focus from America being this benign international giver more than taker from the international system, return back to a kind of sovereign nationalism as the driver of American foreign policy. But he also enjoyed just being disruptive for its own sake, shaking things up, saying I'm not bound by all the conventional rules and practices of the past. But he broke a lot of crockery in that kind of disruptive approach. So, I think the allies, both in Europe and in Asia, found it very, very challenging to work with the Trump administration, and it changed the qualitative part of alliance relationships. Japan is that America's traditional allies since the late 40s and 50s now believe they have to be more independent in their national security policy because they're not sure the United States is as reliable as it had been in the past. Trump also had this kind of interesting fascination with strongmen. He clearly is not a deep, deep Democrat in his persona and his character about how politics should work. So he really admired people who had that capacity to make decisions quickly and didn't have to worry about popular opinion or parliaments. So I think there's a lot of work that the Biden administration will have to do to repair the logic and the underlying purpose of alliance relationships. I think President Trump really enjoyed turning alliance relationships into business transactions. Are both parties benefiting financially was the measure. He did not focus as much on what are the shared values or what is the shared threat perception. But he tried very hard to change policies on North Korea and Iran. And I think on balance, he has very little to show for those. But he does, I think that one of the lasting legacies of Trump is changing the baseline of how we think about China. And I think this is a lasting change, and he will get credit, I think, for waking us up to whether we were too complacent about the nature of the Chinese threat. So he looked at it through an economic prism, perhaps more than a security prism. But he certainly changed the underlying logic and assumption of how the United States should manage the rise of China from a US interest perspective. And I think Biden will not be able to completely change that. I think Biden will use a new baseline for thinking about relations with China. And I hope later in this conversation, we'll get to the very important triangle of US, China, Japan. I do think Trump will also enjoy in his legacy and in the history books the Abraham Accords, the taking advantage of Israel's quiet normalization of relations with some additional Arab countries, not countries that had been enemies, had been at war with Israel, but nonetheless, I think the Trump administration saw an opportunity to advance something that was actually already happening. So that will be a legacy of the Trump administration, even though they did not achieve the larger more, I would say, the greater moral imperative of trying to change Israel-Palestine relations. And in fact, they have set us, from the perspective of democratic national security people, they have set that goal back. So we have a very mixed record. His disruption was not successful in terms of policy towards North Korea or policy towards Iran, but perhaps his lasting legacy is changing the baseline on China. But again, I would say damage with alliance relationships that perhaps can be repaired, but we may not be able to go back to pre-Trump assumptions about how alliances work. Yuki also asked me about the transition process. And as of the last 24 hours, I can say we're in a slightly more normal situation where we should be. So the government has now conceded that Trump himself has never used the word concede, but the administrative process is acknowledging that Biden won the election, that the states have certified the results. He has 306 electoral college votes. That formal electoral college vote doesn't happen until early December, but for now, the funds will be released for the Biden team to actually take over office space, have access to intelligence, and begin the planning process. Even if it had not happened yesterday, I was reasonably confident that the new Biden team, virtually all of whom have worked in government before. We have not seen any new faces yet. These are all people who've worked in government. They were preparing, they know what their jobs are, they know what to expect. But access to the inside information, of course, is absolutely critical. So the transition is on track now in a more normal fashion, but there's no question that President Biden inherits a big, big mess. The mess is both turning the pandemic response in a more productive direction. And I think he has some strong ideas about this, but as he comes into office, the catastrophic effects of the virus are going to still be felt. I mean, even if we can start getting vaccinated in December, the death rate, the stress on our medical system, et cetera, is likely to be terrible when Biden takes office, and the economic consequences of the virus and the shutdown. So President Biden inherits a very hard problem set. And so his transition is going to be very much burdened by the emergency questions of public health, economics. He will not have a honeymoon where he can talk about big new ideas and try to make everybody feel happy. To the contrary, I think this will be a team that will be, hit with very hard work right at the beginning. So, and let's remember, I mean, one way to perhaps take this conversation forward is that President Biden's advisors expect him to spend 80% of his time on domestic issues. And even when his team talks about foreign policy, they talk about foreign policy for the middle class. So not unlike Trump, they are trying to connect what we do in the world has to be connected to what's good for the American people. And so I think this constant linking of foreign policy to whether it affects the prospects for a more stable middle-class American population will be very much on their minds as they think about new initiatives in international affairs.
Thank you, Ellen. I think what you pointed out about this linking of the foreign policy agenda and the how that even under Biden, how that will have to be something positive for that can be felt at home. I think that may be actually one of the unspoken legacy that the Trump administration may have also said, that this direct linkage of foreign policy agenda and how it could or could not affect the American people. So that, I thought that was a very interesting point that you made. And then I also feel like you a little bit better about transition as of this morning, as opposed to when I was emailing you and Kanehara-san about the question that yesterday. But let's get right to the question, actually. There are a couple of very interesting questions. So one is very directly to Mr. Kanehara. Will Japan interfere militarily if China retake Taiwan by force someday? And so that's one. And the second is a little bit more twisted one. So I would just throw it out and invite either of you to tackle. So Mr. Kanehara talked about need to teach China or engage China on the democratic values, but India also is having the very similar issues with the minorities. They do have a, I guess, confrontational approach to some minorities in the office in around Kashmir area. So how does that get reconciled as we continue to talk about the need to engage India as the world's biggest democracy? I think that's actually an interesting, a twisted question. So I will ask Mr. Kanehara to comment on the first very direct one, and invite either of you to comment on the second question.
Okay, thank you very much. On Taiwan. Taiwan is not an easy island to take. It's the size of Kyushu Islands, 23 million, very high mountains in the eastern side. It's much higher than Fuji Mountains. And the amphibious attack, it's not very easy. If they are successful, they have to retain that island. And it's not very easy operation, but because of the size of China and the grossness of China, they might be tempted, not today, but 10 years later. I have to say that after Kissinger went to Beijing, Taiwan's in the shadow of China, and US has a law, Taiwan law, but there's no true military alliance with Taiwan. And the alliance is coined with the military alliance, and we train together. We have the core plan. We train together. That's the reason why we can defend ourselves together. We don't have it with Taiwan. And China is huge. The military power is very much bigger than Japan's ones. We can't do that alone. I have to say that we can't do this alone. And when it's only when the Americans is determined, I'm sure that Washington would ask us. They would never let us go. And I don't think that Korea would join us. They fear China very much, but Japan, by location, would be involved immediately. But for that, Americans cannot engage us overnight. It's a democracy here too. And Japan might suffer from a big damage in a war. But to deter China from taking that island, we have to be prepared somehow. And this is a very delicate show. And I have to say that ambiguity policy of the United States was not to provoke China, because China could be mobilized. But whether we provoke them or not, they're becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, and they're becoming capable of taking Taiwan from us. And then we have to be somehow prepared. It's not to fight a war against China. It's to deter China, stabilize the relationship with China. You can't do that. And their will of the people matters. It's history issue for them, but it's democracy matter for us. And keeping status quo is a deal. And we have to say that to the Chinese. And we have to persuade them not to do that. But they might do it. When they believe that they can finish the war with the snap war, quick war, they might be tempted. Then we have to start persuading them, and we have to be prepared. If we are weak, they might do it. But Japan cannot do it alone. It's only with the United States. And US will is at stake, and the credibility.
So for the next question of India, which one of you would like to tackle? And then also, actually, Ellen, if you would like to start, the same person who asked Mr. Kanehara the very direct question, pretty much asked the same identical question of would U.S. intervene if China tries to take Taiwan militarily one day? So maybe I would ask you to start.
Thanks, Yuki. So I actually am glad, I was planning to jump in on the Taiwan issue as well. As Yuki well knows, our former and late colleague, Alan Ronberg, was, one of the great authorities on the Taiwan Relations Act and this very nuanced way that the United States could do sort of political and economic business with Taiwan, while having de-recognized Taiwan as the Republic of China. So I think we are suddenly confronted again with very uncertain scenarios as China gets more confident and makes some different assumptions about a likely American response. The American security folks better be having conversations about what would we do in the event of a more aggressive Chinese even rhetoric about taking back Taiwan. So we know it's always in their long-term plan, but when does the long-term become now? And I think that, you are completely, I quite agree with you that this is going to be a really hard one because the United States doesn't have any automatic pre-existing legally binding obligation to act militarily and has been depending on its ability to deter China, to always give China incentives to not do it. And we've also had very difficult conversations with Taiwan over the years about whether Taiwan could be doing more to take more, defensive security measures. And I feel there's a very lively debate in the United States among security experts and China experts about what should Taiwan be doing, and is the Taiwan political process agile enough to change their own policies if they themselves believe that the China threat is changing. So I do think that the United States will have to deal with this in a very active way. Implicit in Biden's strategy, remember it was under the Obama administration where the so-called pivot to Asia, whether you like that phrase or not, but the pivot to Asia began. So I think the Biden team is definitely prepared to be spending a lot of their foreign policy time on Asia. And Yuki, if I could segue now to the India question, it is the Indo-Pacific, okay? So this reframing of our Asian strategy as including India, I think is an important piece of the puzzle. So like Mr. Kanehara, we see India as an emerging security partner. I think the Indians probably don't want to be considered a formal ally. They don't want those treaty obligations, but they want to be autonomous in their national security policy, but able to respond as needed. So, and now let me bring in one of Biden's other themes, which is human rights. So will a Biden administration be more assertive on Kashmir? Will we give more feedback to the Indians on our concerns about human rights issues, the Rohingya, Kashmir, inside India, while at the same time trying to nurture this security partnership with India? I think a lot will depend on whether the Indians really feel threatened by China or not. Do they feel that they can manage China on their own? Or do they think they really need to be part of a larger security network that will have some, mutual obligations on the part of India? So I see the India relationship as moving generally in a very, positive direction, but we should not assume that India will give up some of the very prideful independence of their national security policy. I think that is quite embedded in their own identity as one of the great democracies in the world. But again, the twin themes that Biden cares about of human rights, but also strengthening democratic partnerships and networks. He cares about both, and India will hear a message from the Biden administration, I think, on both of those topics.
Thank you, Ellen. I'm sure Kanehara-san has additional comment on that, but let me actually start inserting new questions as I go along, because they're like, right now I'm looking at 17 questions to try to get to, but I'm trying to group all the questions. So one question is, just like U.S., Japan's relationship with other security partners in the Indo-Pacific. So this is a question from Mark Mannion from Congressional Research Service. That how does the Japan work continue to enhance its relations with the other security partners such as Australia, Vietnam, Philippines, and how does under Biden administration you see Japan's Suga administration work with the U.S. to achieve that goal? And in that context, Mr. Kanehara, I thought one of the issues that attracted many audiences' attention is your sense that Korea's strategic alignment is uncertain. So would having a Biden administration as Japan's partner help to improve the current dynamics between U.S.-Japan ROK trilateral cooperation, whether that may be to tackle North Korea or for a long-term challenge by China? And do you think Biden administration can make a positive impact like Obama administration did on the Japan-South Korea relations? So I'll yield the floor to Kanehara-san first, and then hark back to Ellen for, I'm sure she has additional comment on that as well.
Okay, as I said, they are partners. We have to. The Australia, Korea are the most important ones. I have difficulties with Korea today, but beyond that, Philippines and Thailand. And we have to engage Europeans, London, Paris, and Berlin is not interested in the strategic picture of Asia. It's a new phenomenon. We have to engage them. And then others too, Spanish, Poles, and Italians. And then we have to engage ASEAN nations. ASEAN nations are diverse. There's no one face ASEAN. They have many faces here. And the big ones are the Indonesia. And it's a very big one. 300 millions, and that's the one biggest one. And then we have the big ones like Vietnam, the staunch friends of Japan. We trust them, but they're very close to China. The Philippines, they're coastal nations of South China Sea. And then Thailand and Myanmar, these four are big fours. And then Malaysia, half size of that. These are big nations in ASEAN. They have different the attitudes toward Taiwan. Philippines and Vietnam are harder because they are coastal nations. China bullies them. Indonesia is a champion of ASEAN, and they have some problems on Natuna Islands with Chinese, and they stand up. Malaysia, after Najib, Mahathir, and successor, they are moving towards a vigilant position. Thailand is always very good diplomats. Myanmar has ethnic minorities in the mountains controlled by China. They can't face Chinese. They can't do that. And small ones are very influenced by China. Laos, Cambodia, and Brunei. They're very much influenced by China. Chinese play is different. Playbook is different from ours. We talk from the big ones. They grasp the small ones and paralyze the consensus of the region. That's what they do. And they're successful in doing that in EU and in ASEAN nations. But we have to talk to them one by one. And the basic stance is don't involve in big ones fights. That's ASEAN. So we have to assure them stability is here. We are okay. Then please join the free trade zone, make this region prosperous, connectivities. We have talk about economy and the values of democracy. Then we can engage them. We can never treat them with like pawns. We can't do that. They hate to be treated like small nations, to be frontal vis-a-vis China. They'll never do that. It's the other way around. We have to lay down the strategic framework and assure them for the stability of the region and then engage them for economic efforts for the prosperity. This is how to engage ASEAN nations. We have to persuade them one by one. Korea, it's 50 millions, and the economy is the size of Russia today, very big. The biggest exporter of arms apart from China in Asia. This is a great nation today, a brilliant democracy, and we have to engage them. In the long run, Korea is one of the most important neighbors of Japan, and there's no doubt in that. The problem is they're still in the very much domestic Cold War mentality because of the existence of North Korea. And their democracy is young. Democracy is born in 1987. All the leftists jumped out from the jail, and students who helped them, activists, are the generation of Moon Jae-in. It's before the economic development of Korea. But young Koreans are very different. So we have to wait for some ideological and generational shifts, and they will come to some strategic maturity. I have to say, for the moment, with the Moon Jae-in government, it's very difficult to talk about security cooperation. The pro-North Korea policy is their agenda, and they have to please Chinese for that. And they hate to be treated like military ally of Japan. And they say publicly that they will never go into triangular alliance with Japan and the United States. They do this publicly. Amazing, isn't it? But this is the government of the Seoul today, but we have to wait for their strategic maturity. And we think that we can engage Koreans.
Thank you, Kanehara-san. Ellen, I'm sure you have an additional comment, but let me actually attack on another one. One question, actually, there are significant interest in what you mentioned about Biden administration's foreign policy for the middle class. So as your comment to the other Australian and South Korea question, if you can elaborate a little bit more on that. I think many in the audience have asked that, well, how would that look like? And how would that connect with what Prime Minister Abe tried to propose and now succeeded by Prime Minister Suga as a peaceful and prosperous Indo-Pacific concept?
So I don't want to get ahead of the Biden administration. We don't know yet who will be named as Assistant Secretary for the Indo-Pacific region. So there's a lot of story that is still to evolve here. So I don't want to sound like I'm too much certain about how this is likely to play out. But if we try to pull the thread of the last time some of these, Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and others were in government, and what the things they tried to achieve last time around, for sure they will try to pick up on some of those topics. And one of them is this very delicate issue of Korea, Japan, US. I mean, I think the US will still encourage Japan and Korea to try to be more integrated as allies as part of the US system. We're not going to force the creation of an Asian NATO, to the best of my understanding. We will use more flexible concepts in terms of security cooperation, but there's always been, I think, a desire on the part of the United States to figure out how to encourage an easier relationship between Japan and Korea, because there are certainly scenarios in which the United States would expect both countries to try to, work, and the more they can be interoperative or at least communicating clearly, the better it would support an American mission or a specific objective in the region. So, but we now have the Quad concept, and that kind of is a slightly different way of thinking of the security architecture. India, Australia, Japan, US, with others, able to join. So, if we just take the theme that let's repair alliances, let's make our alliance relationships more productive, let's not insult our allies, let's not talk about money all the time, but let's talk about shared security threats. Let's talk about the threat environment and what how we all need to prepare to respond to some hard scenarios. And by the way, those hard scenarios could be like the Fukushima, disaster. They could be climate change driven crises. They're not all going to be geopolitical competition. There's going to be other pressures and scenarios in which the friendly countries of the Indo-Pacific region need to, work well together. So, so I do think that there'll be a little bit of friction maybe between the United States and Japan on this question of, why can't you get along with Korea? And to the Koreans, the same question. And Korea, there's never been a perfect alignment between whether it's the left of center or right of center government in Washington and left of center or right of center in Korea. So we're never on the same wavelength on strategies for North Korea. And that, may be a fairly chronic condition. But I do think that I think we have pushed the Koreans to the point where they want to go more independent of the United States. And this is something that maybe, maybe we will adapt to that and say that's fine, but maybe it will be a little problematic. So where I do see both Korea and Japan wanting to not be drawn into very hawkish policies on China, I see an opportunity for Japan to have an important conversation with the new administration, help that they will be listening. They will be eager to hear Japan's advice about how to avoid the darkest approach to China, an approach that says inevitable conflict, or, we are just geopolitical adversaries, we are enemies. How do we walk that back? Because certainly there are people in the Biden circle that will want to have a more nuanced policy towards China, not a policy that is one-dimensional, but a policy that is multi-dimensional. So that gets us to the, what does national security for the middle class really mean? And I think it means both reducing our military footprint around the world, moving money away from the defense budget to things that are absolutely imperative for our domestic needs and our domestic requirements. But you may not like what it means on free trade, on trade agreements. A policy for the middle class may also be a little bit protectionist about jobs and about the conditions for investment in the United States. And, here's where I think Trump's legacy will live on, that we have to be more tough-minded about whether our economic relationships around the world are we always giving more than we're getting? And should we be tougher? Should we be stricter about trade rules? So I think on free trade, the Democratic Party is going to struggle a bit to find the sweet spot. In theory, they would want to go back into large trade agreements, but I think it will be very hard to negotiate domestically. So those are areas where I think life is going to get messy for the Biden administration. So those are just a couple of thoughts.
Thank you, Ellen. I see Kanehara-san nodding a little bit when she was talking about there has never been a perfect strategic alignment between U.S. and South Korea. So I'm sure you have a word to say about that. Since you just do the two finger, I may ask a couple of trade questions to you, because those two are directly for you. One is how would Japan manage RCEP without the participation of India? So that RCEP will not be dominated by China. And the other one is, how does Japan feel about Chinese potential interest in CPTPP? It's a tongue twister, but those are two that were specifically for you, Kanehara-san.
Okay, thank you very much. The RCEP is, without Americans, have great difficulties. Our friends are the New Zealanders and the Australians. The high standard free trade zone was not possible. We wanted to engage Indians. Indians have, they have meticulous calculation all the time. I take that, we can lose that, and they just dropped off. We're very sorry, but we tried maximum to engage them, but they dropped off. Now we have to face this whole ASEAN plus Japan, Australia, and New Zealand on one hand, Korea somewhere here, and China there. Now we'll have to try to keep this framework functioning. But this is not a very high standard one. This is a low standard one, but it's a start. We have to make this function anyway. That's RCEP. The CPTPP, this is very high standard. This is a true free trade system. And if China wants to join that, they have very much heavy weightlifting to do that. National enterprises, heavy subsidy, they can never do that. It's not free trader. Inside China, they're very different player in this game. And they are saying that they are fearful of being left outside CPTPP. When Biden, I don't think Biden has a liberty to jump in TPP again very soon. But if Americans are back in, this can become a strategic framework outside China. And that China fears that. So China made a call that I can be a part of it. But economically, it's great. It's very difficult for them to join because this is very high standard free trade zone, and their true interest would be to dilute the strategic color of this framework. But as far as Americans are not in, this would not be a true strategic framework. Can I just say one word about Trumpians? We have the same thing here. The many middle-class people and the manufacturers are going out of Japan. It's like in the Rust Belt in the United States. And the manufacturers are less and less in Japan. And there are some people who do not sympathize with the leftist ideas like non-nuclear energy or this agenda, does not ring the bell in their heads. They are patriotic, they're liberal, but they are patriotic. And what they do care is my job, my life. Somebody should take care of my life. And that was the cry of theirs. Nobody listened to them. And that's happened in Japan after Lehman shock. Japanese in their 40s, they truly do not allow our Democrats. They're shouting non-nuclear things and these things. They did not take care of these young people. And they're truly angry. And they are good supporters of LDP. And their concern is economy. Its economy is stupid. That's them. In the United States, they are Trumpians. But in many developed nations whose manufacturers are going out of the nation, we have the same problem. And we have to look to them, and we have to listen to them. We have to take care of them. Otherwise, the government cannot run. Not only domestic, but the foreign policy. I'm sure that many Japanese will start to say, we are paying too much ODA. But we have to, we have to overcome that. The friends, allies matter. It's a big assets. We paid a lot for that. And free trade zone is, we paid a lot for that. We have to keep our legacy functioning still, because we'd be a bigger loser if we listen to the domestic voices alone.
Thank you, Kanehara-san. I actually have another question that are a trade-related question that is related to China, and I think it concerns both the U.S. and Japan. So here you go. What are the limitations of U.S., Japan, and other allied partner countries' cooperation and coordination in China policy when so many of these countries also invest heavily in China? But then, if Chinese are growing industries that are very central to its military-civil fusion, or Made in China 2025. And then I think one of the moving the baseline that you Ellen mentioned about the baseline of China policy under Trump is that making that stricter for this technology flow into China. So how would a Biden administration, as you see it, could make, I guess, a modification or nuanced touch to what is now considered to be a baseline? It is, I would say, very difficult to roll back on some of those aspects.
So I don't claim to be a great expert on this, but I do think this security, the connection between security and economics is going to be, inevitable. That will be part of how the Biden team has to cope with China. Look at how the role of the Treasury has expanded in national security affairs in the United States. So this committee that measures, whether there's a threat by investment by foreign governments or foreign companies in the US, I think that whole mechanism will become more important. Look at the 5G debate that's happening. So the US has taken, under Trump, we took a very tough position on, everybody should be afraid of Chinese technology because it has it's owned by the state. It means that the Chinese state is going to be inside your computer networks, and you have to be, maybe that position was tougher than many countries wanted. But I think the Biden administration will not be able to push that aside. I think that will become a mainstream way of thinking about both, China's economic power, its soft power, its how it distributes its influence in the world, but also the United States being more protective of its own. Think of how much our public has been sensitized that foreign governments can interfere in our national lives through cyberspace. So all the new technology, I don't think any country in the world has completely figured out how to keep your, communications networks and platforms completely protected from international interference. So, that's the paradox of the age we live in, that globalization worked in the sense that some of these systems are just so, don't respect national borders, and by economic self-interest, countries invested and imported and developed these technologies. And now they're seeing the downside of it, and they want to put up more fences and barriers, and it's very hard to do. So I think that Biden administration has no alternative. They're going to have to keep working in this space and look at the Treasury Department as much as the State Department as a key player in some of these issues.
Good.
Thank you for that, Anne. And Kanehara-san, you had a comments to add, probably.
Yes, China is not Soviet Union. They are inside our system. Now they're leaving us, and they are exploiting our system. It's open system. But I have said that the United States is paying $800 billion for national security. It's not only for them; it's for the allies. Half of the world military budget is the American budget. But today, GAFA and the Chinese money is becoming very big. It's 1/4 of the US military budget. It means it's bigger than Japan plus UK plus France plus Germany. They have big money, and development money, the research and developments, it's not included. So they have huge amount of money. And we cannot let one small, say, venture or some corporation shatter our national security. We can't let them do that. So we have to control that. This is not the trade control. This is not investment control. This is not for edge of economic power. This is national security. We have to do that. We have to control it. We have to agree in the first place among allies. Mr. Trump, he changed drastically China policy, but he was a solo drama. He was not orchestrating the allies. He was a solo drama, and Atlantic ties are very much hurt. We are okay, but we are privileged. Japan is only one, and the alliance was not in a good shape. But we need more transparent. We need more systematic explanation from Washington. What shall we do? If it's only Americans, then Japanese going, Germans going, doesn't work. We have to have a systematic, more transparent approach to defend our national security together. And we are waiting for the new approach very much from Washington. Happy to coordinate positions with yours. It's a bit difficult to follow the Mr. Trump. he was just shooting alone. But we have to shoot together. Otherwise, we cannot be successful for this. And the civil military fusion is real. China is very different. The civil military fusion, there's no true civil and military. Chinese party can control everything. In every organization, civil or governmental or the military, they have cells, the Communist Party cells, and they control everything. And they control money, they control personnel, and it's very different. And their ambition is absolutely to be number one in terms of the industry, economy, and the military. And we can't let it happen. This is a true competition. But at the same time, we do not have to stop the toys production in China. Nobody cares. And we have to focus on national security issues there. We have to be vigilant. And the other parts, we don't care who makes the toys or these things. And there, we need orchestration by Washington of the allies. It was lacking in the present administration. Okay.
Great. This has been fascinating conversation, and we only have 2 more minutes to go. So one last question to both of you. To Ellen, there is a question that that you talked about when it comes to this linkage between domestic and foreign policy. So right now, President Trump seemed to be rumored to run again, potentially for 2024. And to what extent do you think him continuing to have that solid supporter from what Mr. Kanehara explained as Trumpians could hinder Biden administration's foreign policy effort as they try to go back to more of an internationalist engagement-based issue? And for Mr. Kanehara, if you have a comment or two to make on that, please do so. But then also to you, I do have the very direct question of how does the appointment of Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and the Senator Kerry or Secretary Kerry's appointment in the key foreign policy positions is received in Japan, and how do you think that are generally received amongst the like-minded allies like Japan? So that'll be the last question to both of you.
So Yuki, I'm very glad to have that question because I think it's a missing piece that this era of terrible polarization in American politics, decline of respect for institutions, erosion of trust in our society. These did not go away when Biden won the election. So I think the Biden administration will definitely be hampered or constrained by the continued existence of Trump's world. And let's remember, Trump received 73 million votes, and which is a huge number. And in a normal election year, that could have been the majority of votes, but it wasn't, because we had such an extraordinary turnout of American voters. So I quite agree with the premise of the question that Trump will be using anything Biden does that Trump would see as weakness, as the United States, giving too much to other countries. I think he will use that to beat his drum. However, I don't think foreign policy is that important to the Trump voters. So what he needs to do to keep his Trump world, his Trump support base intact, isn't really heavily dependent on foreign policy. I think it is about a set of grievances, a set of anxieties about multiculturalism. And I think that Trump will definitely try to keep alive, whether he goes into a media position, owns some kind of a media company, or starts running for office again. He will be playing on what are some of these domestic anxieties about immigration, et cetera. And he will, use the stick of foreign policy, but I don't think it will be the primary focus. But thank you for raising those issues.
Kanehara-san, last word from you.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me today. Trumpians would make great difficulties for trade issues. We want very much Americans are back to TPP, but it will not be easy because Trumpians are, look at me, one, America first, and take care of me. And I hate elites, I hate leftists, and take care of me. That's Trumpians. And their voice is real, and that they would make great difficulties for trade talks with Americans. That's my comment on Trumpians. As for Blinken, Jake Sullivan, we know them because they were there when Abe-san took power. They were just in the White House and they were respected. We're very much assured that the good professionals are taking care of American foreign policy. And unlike Trump administration, under Biden administration, the normalcy will be back. I mean, institutions will be back, states, NSC, and Pentagon will be back. We have to coordinate among these three big triangles. As our triangles, we must coordinate. And China will do the same, Korea will do the same, everybody will do the same. But this is a good adjustment of interest policy, the policy machine. We're happy that the Blinken and Jake Sullivan are in charge of that. Mr. Kerry must work for taking back climate change, and he did it. So he must do it again.
Great. With that, thank you again for both for joining us today, and thank you, everyone. I try to clear 17 questions. There's still 19 more outstanding questions that I was not able to get to, but hopefully for those of you who didn't have their question answered, I'm really sorry I couldn't get to it, but hopefully you still found this conversation fascinating. I certainly did. So again, thank you, Kanehara-san, Ellen, joining me, and thank you for wherever you are, those of you who are chiming in. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. And this concludes this year's Voices from Japan National Security Speaker Series. Thank you all, and have a great rest of the day.